May 14th, 1941. Atlantic Ocean. The world was in chaos, with the war stretching its tendrils across continents. Yet the sea remained the greatest battleground of all. Beneath the cold, churning waves of the North Atlantic, Allied convoys fought an invisible enemy. The German U-boats. Silent, deadly predators that stalked the merchant vessels. Their sonar almost untraceable, their crews relentlessly precise. The U-boat captains, trained, battle-hardened men, held the upper hand. They knew the water better than anyone, and their prey could do nothing but attempt to evade the inevitable. The war at sea, from the outside, appeared to be a brutal game of cat and mouse. But on the inside, there was something far more treacherous at play, a code. A code so tightly encrypted that even the brightest minds at Bletchley Park, the center of Britain's most covert intelligence efforts, struggled to crack it. The Germans had perfected a cipher, the Enigma machine, a mechanical beast that twisted and turned every message sent across the waves, encoding them into a labyrinth of seeming randomness. To crack it, they would need to penetrate an invisible barrier, and every failed attempt brought the Allies closer to defeat. Lieutenant Commander X sat at his desk, thousands of miles from the decryption centers of Bletchley, with the harsh winds of the Atlantic slapping against the deck of his ship. He wasn't a man of high rank or importance in the grand scheme of the Royal Navy. He had no prestigious background, no brilliant academic history. He was an officer, an observer, someone who watched the battles from the edge of the action, more in the realm of strategic coordination than battlefield leadership. But it was this very vantage point, this distance from the chaos, that allowed him to see what others could not. As the U-boat threat intensified, the convoy's survival depended on outsmarting the enemy. Standard procedure was no match for the cunning of the German captains. But Lieutenant Commander X noticed something in the patterns of their attacks, something small but significant, a flaw in the way they communicated. While others were focused on the predictable German radio transmissions, he observed that the very nature of the transmissions suggested a vulnerability. It wasn't just the timing or the frequency, it was the structure, the rhythm of the messages themselves. The codes were too consistent, almost too mechanical. He saw a pattern that didn't quite fit. It wasn't randomness at all. It was a sequence, a rhythm, an encrypted signature that the Germans thought was invisible. By May, the threat was at a boiling point. Convoys were being sunk at an alarming rate, and each new loss was a blow to the Allied war effort. The pressure from higher-ups was mounting. There were desperate calls for someone, anyone, to find a way to crack the enigma before it was too late. But while the best minds at Bletchley were tirelessly grinding through the night, Lieutenant Commander X had a different kind of insight. He wasn't trying to break the cipher with the brute force of a machine or a codebreaker's mind. Instead, he was observing the nature of the enemy's communication like an artist listening to the faintest whispers of a distant tune. He saw beyond the immediate, the mundane. He saw the pattern within the noise. But this discovery was dangerous. His superiors in the Navy weren't interested in abstract ideas or theoretical possibilities. They wanted results, immediate, actionable intelligence. He had no time to build a comprehensive case. There was no grand formal report, no piece of paper that could adequately capture what his mind was processing. What he had was a hunch, an idea that might be the key to changing the tide of the war. Yet his rank and position didn't carry enough weight to force his observations to the top. He wasn't the right man in the right place at the right time. He was simply a man who noticed something no one else did. So he took the risk. He approached the matter like a man testing the edges of a cliff. Not quite stepping off, but leaning over, peering into the unknown. He took what he'd observed and began testing it with his own equipment. With each passing day, he grew more certain of the theory he was building. If he could manipulate the transmissions just right, if he could understand the small differences in timing and structure, then perhaps, just perhaps, the Allies could anticipate the U-boat movements before they even struck. But there was a problem. His superiors wouldn't trust him. Not fully. They had their own systems, their own methods, and to introduce a new approach without backing was nothing short of madness. They couldn't see it. Not yet. June 2nd, 1941. Plymouth, England. He received a stern reprimand for his unapproved testing. Yet something in him refused to relent. He wasn't the hero of this story. He wasn't trying to save the world, at least not in the heroic sense. But he knew this was bigger than the Navy. It was bigger than the war itself. The lives of countless sailors and soldiers were caught in a game of shadows, and he had discovered a crack in the wall. But there was no applause, no celebration, just the cold indifference of a military machine that couldn't appreciate the value of intuition. What followed was a personal decision. He wasn't one for the spotlight, but he couldn't sit idly by. He gathered a small group of trusted colleagues, engineers, cryptographers, and outsiders who, like him, didn't quite fit into the traditional military hierarchy. Together, they began to refine his discovery. It was a dangerous gamble. They were working against time, against protocol, against everything the system said was right. But in the world of warfare, sometimes the greatest advantage came not from following orders, but from defying them. Yet, even with their success, even with the breakthrough they achieved, there was a bitter irony waiting for them. Because while this ragtag team had done what the greatest minds at Bletchley could not, their success would be buried, lost beneath layers of military politics and secrecy. Their work would not be celebrated as it should. Their contribution, their defiance, and their courage would be obscured by the larger narrative of war. And their names would slip quietly into the forgotten corners of history. July 9th, 1942. London, England. The war was grinding on, and every day seemed to bleed into the next, a relentless march of failure and fleeting triumph. While the great minds at Bletchley Park toiled under the suffocating weight of secrecy, cracking code after code, it was becoming increasingly clear that the war at sea was evolving into something more insidious. The U-boats were more agile, more deadly. They knew the Atlantic better than anyone. To counter this threat, the Allies needed more than just intelligence. They needed innovation, something different, something no one had yet thought of. Lieutenant Commander X, already a man out of step with the military machine, found himself standing at a crossroads. He knew that his discovery could change the outcome of this brutal battle, but he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. The system was too rigid, too bound by protocol and structure. To make his idea a reality, he had to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't going to wait for the military to catch up. He wasn't going to wait for Bletchley Park's approval. He had seen what they couldn't see, and that vision was enough to ignite something deep inside him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He decided to bypass the hierarchy entirely. His superiors had dismissed him, but he wasn't willing to give up on the men in the convoys or the sailors who were dying without even knowing why. So, he went outside the system. It wasn't easy, of course. He knew the risks of challenging the status quo. But Lieutenant Commander X understood something that many others didn't. The military was a machine that relied on order and predictability. It didn't do well with irregularity, with intuition, with the unquantifiable. But in war, unpredictability could be a weapon. And that's where he came in. He found a small group of outsiders, cryptographers, engineers, and technical experts, men and women who weren't bound by the traditional methods of warfare. They weren't thinking within the confines of the established systems. They were willing to challenge everything, to think outside the box. It was risky, but it was the only way forward. In the quiet hours of the night, the small team gathered, often under the radar of their respective agencies. They pored over his findings, analyzing every bit of data, dissecting the code that had eluded the best minds at Bletchley. Lieutenant Commander X didn't care for accolades. He didn't care for recognition. All he cared about was making sure the convoys had a fighting chance. Each new discovery felt like an urgent step closer to victory. But the further he went, the more he realized that his work was more than just tactical. It was philosophical. It was a shift in how war could be fought. His small group of outsiders was changing the course of the battle not just through intelligence, but through defiance of what the military thought was possible. The Navy's resistance to innovation became more apparent as they moved forward with their work. The military system was slow to accept anything that wasn't grounded in traditional doctrines. There were no guarantees that Lieutenant Commander X's discovery would succeed. No assurances that his unconventional methods would bear fruit. But they pressed on, driven by a shared belief that they could do something the establishment couldn't. Every step was a gamble, but it was a gamble they were willing to take. The risk didn't faze them. What mattered was that they had a chance to make a difference. By the end of June, they were ready to test their theories. They began applying their findings in the field, making small but critical changes to the way they tracked U-boats and the convoys they protected. The results were immediate. The U-boat captains were forced to change their tactics. The Allies, for the first time in months, were anticipating their moves before they were even made. It wasn't a grand victory, not yet, but it was the beginning of something much larger. The convoy survival was no longer a matter of luck. It was a matter of strategy. But this success came with a price. The small team of outsiders, in their blind dedication to their work, began to suffer the consequences of their rebellion against the established system. They were seen as troublemakers, as mavericks. The traditional officers, those who still held the reins of power, couldn't understand how a small group of uncredentialed men and women could have accomplished what they did. And so, as quickly as they had begun to experiment, the official channels sought to shut them down. They were told to stand down, to leave their work behind. They were told to trust the process, to wait for the established protocols to catch up. But for Lieutenant Commander X, there was no turning back. The stakes were too high. Too many lives had already been lost. He pushed forward, despite the obstacles, despite the growing resistance. Every test, every experiment, was a step closer to a breakthrough. And then, on July 9th, 1942, their moment arrived. They had cracked the code, at least the code of the U-boats. The strategies they had put into place were now working. The convoys were safer. The U-boat crews, once impenetrable, were now vulnerable. For the first time, the Allies were playing offense, not defense. Lieutenant Commander X and his team had done what was thought impossible. They had shifted the balance of power at sea. But despite the monumental achievement, something more insidious began to creep into their work. The very system that had resisted them from the beginning now wanted to claim their success. The victory wasn't theirs to enjoy. It wasn't theirs to share. Instead, the credit was slowly siphoned off, shifted to the bureaucrats and higher-ups who had done nothing to contribute to the breakthrough. Lieutenant Commander X was offered a small recognition, nothing more than a medal and a pat on the back. The team's efforts were buried under layers of military red tape, their names erased from the official record. And yet, the world changed. The war continued, and the tides began to turn. But the men and women who had made it possible were left in the shadows. Their names would be forgotten, their contributions buried under the weight of institutional pride and bureaucracy. But the victory was real. And as the war drew to a close, one thing became clear. The outsiders had won, and the insiders had failed to even recognize it. November 3rd, 1944. Washington, D.C. The war was winding down, but the stories of those who had helped to turn the tide were already being forgotten. Across the ocean, the convoys continued to sail, and the U-boats, once so menacing, were now being hunted with an intensity that had never been seen before. The tables had turned, but the men who had made it possible, those who had fought against the grain and reshaped the future of naval warfare, remained little more than ghosts. Forgotten by the bureaucracy they had defied, they were erased from the history that would be written by the victors. Their success had been crucial, but their names were already slipping into the dark crevices of history, lost to time. Lieutenant Commander X knew that, no matter what he had done, no matter how many lives had been saved or how many U-boats had been sunk, the war machine would move on. He had made his peace with that. What stung, however, was not the lack of recognition. It was the fact that those who truly understood the stakes, the sacrifice, and the triumph would never be honored in the way they deserved. The official records would be written, the medals would be given, and history would remember the larger-than-life figures, the generals, the admirals, the politicians. But it would never remember the small group of men and women who had dared to challenge the system and, against all odds, succeeded. In the years that followed, Lieutenant Commander X found himself stationed in increasingly obscure postings, his reputation steadily diminishing in the eyes of the institution he had once served so loyally. The small team of outsiders, once hailed as mavericks by their peers, was soon forgotten. The world had moved on to other wars, other battles, and the narrative of the war at sea had already been shaped into something clean and neat, a story that could be told in textbooks and speeches. The contributions of the few had become overshadowed by the glory of the many. Yet, despite the official erasure, there remained an unspoken truth. The Allies had won the Battle of the Atlantic, not because of any superior military strategy or equipment, but because a small group of individuals had seen what no one else had seen. They had understood that the real victory was not in following orders or waiting for permission to act. It was in questioning the status quo, in taking the risks that others were too afraid to take. And this truth, the real story, was buried deep beneath the surface, a truth that would never see the light of day. The years stretched on. The world continued to recover from the war, and the institutions that had been challenged slowly regained their footing. As the Cold War took shape, the world focused on the new threats that had emerged, leaving the lessons of the past to gather dust. But for Lieutenant Commander X, the question lingered. What did it all mean? What had been the point of defying the system, of risking everything, if the world would simply forget? He continued to watch as others received the accolades, as politicians and high-ranking officers took credit for victories that were not theirs. He saw the names of those who had shaped the war at sea, men whose contributions had been far less significant, engraved in the annals of history. Meanwhile, the true pioneers remained in the background, relegated to the margins of the story. He had been given a medal, yes, but it was a hollow gesture, a recognition that came far too late and with far too little understanding of what had truly been achieved. The medal, though it glittered with honor, never held the weight of true recognition. It was merely a token, an object that would forever be linked with the shadow of indifference. Lieutenant Commander X had received it, but it had never been for the right reasons. No one, not even those who awarded it, understood the magnitude of what he had done. No one could comprehend the lives saved, the strategies invented, the small moments of brilliance that had changed the course of a war. The official story had already been written, and in that story, he was little more than a footnote. But the question still haunted him. Why had it been so easy for the military to overlook those who had done the impossible? Why was it that the ones who truly changed the outcome of the war were often the ones left behind, their contributions discarded like so much old equipment? Was it because their success didn't fit the narrative the military wanted to tell? Or was it because their innovation was a threat to the very structure that had allowed the war to be fought in the first place? For the rest of his life, Lieutenant Commander X would carry that question with him. He would never know why he was forgotten, why the war would be remembered by others who had not seen what he had seen, who had not dared to do what he had done. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. Not that his name would fade into obscurity, but that history would never truly understand the cost of erasure. The real cost of victory was not measured in medals or monuments. It was measured in the forgotten stories, the unacknowledged contributions, and the silent sacrifices of those who changed the world without ever being recognized for it.